Welcome to the future of the GOP, a moderated discussion that is even more timely, it turns out, than I thought it would be when we started planning this back in November. I'm David Barker, the director of AU's Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies, which is proud to sponsor this event. We are very fortunate to be joined today by three eminent thought leaders who have all contributed to Republican Party politics in important ways. Over the next hour and 15 minutes or so, we'll be gaining their informed insight on what comes next for that institution many still call the Grand Old Party, the party of Lincoln, of Teddy Roosevelt, of Eisenhower, of Reagan, and yes, also of Trump. I think everyone would admit that things don't feel so grand right now for that party. In fact, they feel pretty precarious for the party that finds itself locked out of power for the first time in over a decade, a position it has only been in for 8 other years since 1968, I might add. A party that, despite its policy victories since 1992, has won only one popular vote for president during that time. A party facing demographic currents that many predict will make it harder and harder for them to win in the future, including in the South. And a party that is at a current crossroads over how committed it should remain to the free market, how committed it should remain to leading the free world, how committed it should remain to any kind of shared reality with Democrats, and of course, how committed it should remain to former President Trump. After I'm done picking the brains of our esteemed guests, you'll get a chance to do so as well. You can ask a question anytime you want to using the chat function, and when we get to that portion of the event, I will read through and pose as I can to our panelists in the time that we have. I do ask that you keep your questions civil, that you avoid those with an obvious partisan or ideological agenda behind them, and that you phrase your question, as Alex Trebek would say. I'll be skipping over any questions that do not adhere to those norms. Okay, so now it's time to introduce our distinguished panelists. First off, Sara Fagen is a political commentator for ABC News and the CEO and founder of Deeproot Analytics, a leading analytics and technology company that she founded in 2013 that helps communications professionals reach target audiences more effectively. Ms. Fagen was White House political director for President George W. Bush, where she helped enact some of President Bush's most significant legislative accomplishments, and she also played a key role in the president's 2004 re-election campaign as a senior strategist. She is a regular commentator, as I mentioned, on ABC News. Okay, Henry Olsen is a Washington Post columnist and a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He is author or co-author of 2 books, The Working Class Republican, Ronald Reagan and the Return of Blue-Collar Conservatism, and with Dante J. Scala, The 4 Faces of the Republican Party. He is a frequent guest on television and radio programs, and he speaks regularly about American political trends and global populism in the United States, Europe, and Australia. Finally, last but not least, we have Trevi Troy. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, the former Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and a former Deputy Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. He is the best-selling author of 5 books on presidential history, including, most recently, Fight House: Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. Dr. Troy has also published over 300 journalistic articles in outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, Commentary, and The Atlantic. He appears frequently on television and radio to discuss healthcare, presidential history, and other issues. Okay, so the first question I have for all 3 of you, and I guess I'll just pose this to you in the order that I introduced you. So Sara, then Henry, then Trevi, is if you could choose just one or maybe 2 words to describe the current party, what would they be? And so if you could just tell us your word and then elaborate a bit on what you mean by that. Sara? Oh, I think you're muted.
I mean, such a rookie move right out of the gate. Sorry about that. I think the word I would use most is uncertain. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the Republican Party. It stems from Trump. You know, will Trump make a return? Will he run again? Will he somehow, even if he doesn't run, get involved in the primary, the 2024 primary or primaries forthcoming in the next midterms? I think that is a major factor in the future of the Republican Party. I think it's also, certainly with nobody at the helm of any chamber or certainly the White House, obviously, it's uncertain who the leader of their party is. People often sort of forget that political parties, there's not some meeting that takes place where everybody gets in a room, and decides the future of the party. This is a loose confederation of lots of power centers. But when there's a Senate Majority Leader or a president, of course, that person is the dominant leader or the face of the party. And we don't have that. So it's uncertain who that will be and if that person can emerge over the course of the next couple of years after the next midterm. And then I think certainly, lastly, uncertain as to who the nominee is going to be, because political movements often follow people. And as dark as it might seem for the Republican Party today, a new leader can also energize the party in 2.5, 3 years. And so many of this commentary about the Trump voters will leave if he goes away or if he feels mistreated by people in the party. That may be true today. That's not necessarily going to be true 3 years from now when there's a new leader who is exciting people with his or her own agenda. So to me, the word I would think of is uncertain.
All right, thanks a lot. Henry?
The word I'm using is scared. That the Republican voter base is scared of Democratic control. They're often scared about different things. Cultural conservatives being scared about religious liberty and social media deplatforming, economic conservatives scared about the growth of regulation and the federal government, other conservatives scared about the rise of progressive woke ideology. But I think one of the things that has characterized and helped explain why President Trump could keep the party's voter base behind him was that many were scared of Democratic dominance and were willing to overlook his many manifest eccentricities and flaws in order to make sure that the thing they really cared about, making sure their fears never came true, was front and center. So I also think they're scared of a future. Again, different groups, some groups scared of a future without Trump, some groups scared of a future with Trump. But I think at this moment, scared is the word I would choose.
All right, thanks a lot. How about you, Trevi?
So thanks for this, David. And I think your question of picking one word is really a good way to focus the mind. And my one word is embattled. And I say that because no matter how you look at the Republicans, through which lens, I think the group you look at would be embattled. Even if, let's say, you take the MAGA-y, Trumpy Republicans, they feel embattled. They feel like everyone's blaming them for the insurrection. They feel like they're being blamed by others in the GOP for the election loss. They feel like they're being delegitimized and threatened of being canceled. If you look at the kind of, I guess, more traditional or perhaps the Trump critical Republicans, they feel embattled by the Trump Republicans. You saw Liz Cheney takes that vote on impeachment, and then Matt Gaetz flies to Wyoming to do an event. I don't know, why is he going to Wyoming? I don't know what does he have constituents in Wyoming? I don't know what's bringing him there. But so if you are taking a stand in a different direction, you feel embattled by the Trumpy Republicans, which could be interpreted as a majority of the party. I don't know if they really are a majority of the party, but they certainly have voted that way in recent years. If you're just a Republican who is concerned with what Henry so euphemistically called Trump's eccentricities, but you like certain policies, if you like policies to move in a conservative direction, you're certainly embattled because you're looking at the Biden administration, which I think is being much more aggressive than originally intended, especially on the regulatory front. And you're saying, I don't like these policies. Even if I was concerned about Trump and let's say I held my nose and voted for Biden, why is the Biden administration moving in this particularly lefty direction? So you feel embattled there. And then if you're in the House or the Senate, you feel embattled all the time. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, certainly not my style of Republican, but they're trying to kick her off her committees, and Republicans are thinking, am I next? Who's next? Or are they going to go after me afterwards? So I think there's that embattled thing. And the other thing about this is, if you had asked me this before January 6th, I might have used a different word, which would have been emboldened, not that many letters different. But after the election, I kind of looked around and said, hey, this is a pretty good result. Trump is repudiated, but so are woke liberals. And it was kind of an election that said, maybe we want some normality. Maybe we want conservative policies without the kind of Twitter and constant warfare, but we don't, and we certainly don't want defunding the police, and we don't want cancellation culture. So I think wokeism and Trumpism were repudiated before, in the election and in the period leading up to January 6th, but post January 6th, and when I say January 6th, I don't just mean the insurrection of the Capitol, although that's certainly part of it. I also mean the results of that Georgia race, where Republicans after Election Day felt that they were going to hold on to the Senate, and history suggests, if you look at Georgia runoffs, that it was a pretty good bet that they were going to hold on to the Senate. And the reason they didn't hold on to the Senate is both the fact that the former president was making a lot of noise about the election defeat and cheating and all that stuff, but also the whole claim about $2,000, that he joined the Democrats and said, oh, I'm going to get you $2,000, after there'd been a negotiation for $600 as part of the COVID relief package. And so those two election losses in Georgia did not have to be thus. And Henry could talk at much greater length about this than I. So I think that embattledness is exacerbated by this sense that they felt emboldened not that long ago. And then those few words and the few letters in the middle of the word changed, and now they feel embattled.
Yeah, my initial take after the election in November was much the same, that hey, this is a pretty good outcome if you're a never Trumper or a Lincoln Project Republican, right? Because it seemed like you got everything that you would have wanted, right? You got rid of Trump, but otherwise Republicans did pretty well, and you assumed they were going to hold on to the Senate as well, which would have been a pretty good position. But things do look quite a bit differently now. I hadn't planned on asking this right now, but since in your response, Trevi, you mentioned both Marjorie Taylor Greene and Liz Cheney. I think for the benefit of our viewers here, I'll just sort of quickly mention what's going on there. Liz Cheney, the number 3 Republican in the House, voted to impeach Trump, and she's facing backlash for that from many in her caucus, and they're going to be voting to decide whether or not to strip her of that leadership role. While at the same time, Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the opposite end of the spectrum, has come under intense fire for a lot of her past embrace of, and current embrace of conspiratorial thinking, to put it mildly. And so she's, facing potentially losing her positions on committees. As I understand it, some of the other leaders in the House met with her last night and discussed amongst themselves and decided to not do that preemptively themselves. But there will be a vote on that tomorrow. So let me ask, any of you or all of you, looking forward, who's going to have more power in the Republican Party next year, Marjorie Taylor Greene or Liz Cheney?
I'd be happy to jump in on that. I think that if you look in 5 years, Liz Cheney is still going to be a force in Republican politics, and Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be the answer to a trivia question. So she won a very close primary with, I believe, 12 people in there. It's a heavily Republican district, so the Republican primary is effectively the election. And I think a year from now, it's going to be 2022, she's going to be up for election again. And I don't think she wins. I'd love to hear Henry's thoughts on that. But I think Liz Cheney is an important voice in the Republican Party and will continue to be. And I really think that there is just a false dichotomy. I think when they try and describe the schism in the GOP, they say it's between moderates and conservatives. I don't believe that is the case at all. I think the GOP is generally a conservative party, and the schism is between people in the reality-based community and the non-reality-based community. I read this book called The Great Rift that talk about the fight between between Cheney and Powell. They were very close friends in the first Bush administration and more antagonists in the second. And when Dick Cheney, the father, was in the House of Representatives, he would get irate when the Washington Post would call him a moderate. He was a moderate because they called him a moderate because he believed in governing and regular order, but he's no moderate. And he would complain, will somebody tell the Washington Post that I'm no moderate? So again, I think the schism here is between the reality-based community, and I would say Liz Cheney's part of it, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who believes in space lasers.
Okay, you've gone off, you've covered a lot there. I'd love to hear from Sara and Henry on any of these points.
I agree with Trevi completely. I think that's the way this is going to play out. You know, as to whether Congresswoman Cheney, gets stripped or not, I think that's probably a little harder to know sitting here today, but I suspect not. I mean, she is an incredibly articulate person. She has deep convictions. Her last name is Cheney. I can't imagine at the end of the day her colleagues are going to actually strip her of the job, but I suspect she might have to apologize for some poor use of words, but not apologize for the vote she cast, and it will be fine. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene, on the other hand, should be stripped of her committee assignments. I think Republicans need to do a better job of sanctioning our members when they do and say things that are absolutely crazy. There is a wide space for divergent views on a lot of issues, but that is not what we're talking about here. This is a person trading in conspiracy theories, and it does not behoove the party to allow that nuttiness to take up so much oxygen when she, as Trevi pointed out, is likely to get primaried and be defeated, in a little over a year and a half from now. So I think they should remove her.
I don't think either is terribly influential in the party right now, in the sense that I think that Liz Cheney holds leadership position, but I don't think she influences the direction of the party in a significant degree. And I think Marjorie Taylor Greene is somebody who is a momentary media star because she touches all the Democrats' buttons. Now, the fact is, she is out there. I wrote a column back in June before her runoff that she should be opposed by the Republican establishment. They chose not to do it. The reason she won her race is because nobody ever brought up the issues that people were talking about, that her opponent, John Cowan, refused to talk about her embrace of conspiracy theories. And it was basically a moderate conservative versus a aggressive, more modern fighting conservative. And in rural Georgia in 2020, 57% chose her and 43% chose the more traditional Republican. But I don't think that there will be a majority for her if a Republican is willing to actually call her what she is, which is a loony conspiracy theorist, and say you can have all the conservative without the crazy. And that comes to the question of where the Republican Party needs to go, is that there's no return to a Republican Party of a pre-Trump era where nobody talks about cultural issues, where the economic issues tend to be debated with neo-libertarian presumption, and where foreign policy is conducted in the backdrop of the unusual global dominance we had between 1989 and the rise of Putin in China in the mid-2000s. There is a return for a sane conservative populist alliance, which I think properly executed does win a majority of the vote in this country. And if we move in that direction where populists and conservatives can agree on the need to fight in a sane and effective way, then I think there's a majority. And that does not contain Marjorie Taylor Greene. The question is, does somebody like Liz Cheney want to be part of a conservative populist party, or does that wing basically want to minimize the place where their voter base has moved in a less orthodox conservative direction over the last 15 years?
Thanks a lot. I'm glad that you took us in that direction, which is where I wanted to go next, which is really the future ideologically of the party and the degree to which, it is still, a conservative has been. And by that, I would talk about the traditional marriage of libertarian or free market economics with, religious and cultural conservatism with regard to issues like abortion and gay rights, combined with a muscular, militaristic, internationalist foreign policy. I'm gathering from what you said, Henry, and also what many of us have read and other contributions that you've made, that you definitely see the party moving in more of a populist direction. And certainly that was reflected, right, in Trump and the presidency of Trump. It's also been reflected in the base constituency of the party, right? And you see it in, the rhetoric of even people like Tucker Carlson, right? But I think, it's funny that term populism, I wonder if a lot of our viewers might be a little bit confused by it, because it gets bandied about to mean a whole lot of different things. Bernie Sanders and Hugo Chavez have been described as populists, and pretty much, a lot of time I think people who would maybe better be described as authoritarian or nativist or ethno-nationalist or something else like that get described as populists. I think that's not the kind of populism you're describing. And so maybe if you could elaborate for us a little bit what you mean by a new, populist party that is going to be in coalition with the conservatives. And then we'll get Trevi and Sara to chime in on all that.
Yeah, with respect to populism, I wrote an essay in National Affairs about 10 or 11 years ago about populism, where I talked about it in a more academic sense. Basically, there's good populism and there's bad populism. Bad populism leads us towards authoritarianism of the left or the right. Both Chavez and Hitler were populists, but what they shared was a desire to destroy and remove their adversary, treating their adversaries as enemies. American politics has always, as I said in that article, been characterized by good populism, which is identifying an elite or a group that is identified as the source of a problem. But then after a coalition is built around the removal of that, whether it's the Southern slave power during Lincoln, or whether it's the alleged monarchists of the Federalists in the election of Jefferson, you then treat those people as fellow citizens. You don't deprive them of their rights. You continue to argue rather than to suppress. And that has meant that American populism has always been a force for renewal rather than for rejection. In the current context, what I would say is that the 2001 consensus that was celebrated in around the world is bankrupt. It's bankrupt because it failed to meet the foreign policy challenges of the rise of a Beijing, Moscow, Tehran axis. It is bankrupt economically because it failed to protect lesser skilled people across the globe, not just in the United States, from the downsides of globalization and migration and automation. And it failed particularly in America in a social sense because the elites' metropolitan values were often carried home to excessive degrees in a way that we see in what we call the culture wars, and that happens in other countries as well, just to a lesser degree, in part because of our heritage. And so that tripartite consensus worked politically for a different time. Elements of it are still part of the conservative populist alliance. The Republican Party can't be a party of socialism and should not be, but it should not be a party of hands-off economics. It should not be a party that relies on Christian appeal rather than broad social appeal to talk about issues of the family. And it should not be a party that behaves in a way that it presumes global dominance in a world where we no longer have the economic or military dominance that we had even 12 years ago, much less 21 years ago. So a conservative populist alliance recognizes those things, builds on the conservatism of the past, and as we saw in 2020, is more attractive to the growing non-white populations than a repackaged 2001 era Republican Party, which is distinctly non-attractive to non-whites and that growing group because it doesn't speak to their cultural heritage or to their place in the American hierarchy.
The amazing thing about Henry is he's so prolific that whatever subject comes up, he's written an essay about it previously. But look, obviously, I think he's generally right. But I think the one other thing we want to look at is the force of personality in all this. The Republican Party was the party of George W. Bush 13 years ago. And in the last 4 years, it's been the party of the former president. But in 2024, and Sara alluded to this, somebody is going to win the Republican nomination. And the party will be reshaped in his or her image. And the Republican and Democratic parties in America are different than the European parliamentary democracy parties, which kind of have a set series of policies, and whoever kind of climbs to the top of that greasy pole inherits those policies. In the American system, the person who becomes the party standard bearer really helps set what the policies are through the party platform. Now, I thought it was instructive that in this last convention, the Republicans didn't even bother to put out a platform. And I think that's in large part because it was all about the force of personality of the previous president. But I think going forward, you are going to have someone who takes the mantle, becomes the head of the Republican Party, establishes a platform, hopefully figures out a way to appeal to suburban voters, and especially suburban women voters, in a way that the GOP has not been able to in the era of the non-reality-based community, but can also continue to integrate those working class voters. Henry wrote a book, a great book. I've cited it and called it one of my favorite books from a couple of years ago, about working class Republicans, about Ronald Reagan. And my wife told me not to do this, but I intentionally wore my Ronald Reagan sweatshirt for this event because Ronald Reagan really was able to do this. He was able to bring together different parts of not the Republican coalition, but the American community. Ronald Reagan didn't have a specific message for African Americans and for Jews and for Hispanics. He had a broad message about America and what brings us together as Americans. And that was in stark contrast to the Democratic Party at the time, which was just going after narrow demographic slices, was trying to put it together like a puzzle, whereas Ronald Reagan had this larger tableau of what makes people American. And that shared perspective, I think, helped him win 2 elections and helped George H.W. Bush win a 3rd.
I would just jump in and say I think the future of the Republican Party is certainly working class, and there are elements of populism, of course. Look, set aside Donald Trump's character flaws, Twitter account, however you want to describe it. He largely got the formula right for success in politics. I don't happen to agree with everything that he promoted, even as a Republican. However, he would have won this election, but for 15 examples of stupid things that he did to shoot himself in the foot. Had he just dialed it back on COVID a bit, had he not gotten COVID, had he, not had as many dumb, nasty fights on Twitter, it was a relatively close election, and at least in terms of the electoral college process in which we live. And the reason that he did well, as Henry pointed out, is because, there were enough minorities, who looked at the Trump populism message, not the man, but the policies, and said, yeah, I think I like that more than where I see the Democratic Party going. There are a lot of suburban voters who, but for Trump's style, would have been Republicans and voted Republican. Republicans actually had a very good night on election night. We picked up a governor's race, picked up a whole bunch of House seats Republicans were not expected to win. We're well positioned to keep the Senate. What happened in Georgia was a function of the aftermath of the election, not the, what was going on pre-November. And so where I think the biggest open question in my mind isn't that we're going to be more working class focused than, maybe in the last couple decades, but going back closer to sort of how Reagan talked about working class people, is where we're going to be on the foreign stage. And I think that to me is a much more open question. You and I talked about it over email, David, just sort of the Cheney, Wolfowitz sort of wing of the party. I mean, that's very anti-Trump. And you cite that. You hear people talk about the fact that Trump was the first person in the presidential office, that didn't basically get us into a conflict of either party. And that appeals to a lot of Americans now, particularly when you have a almost permanent underclass, as you see sort of people's fortunes diverging, where people who tend to be on the upper end of the economy tend to be able to withstand any storm and get wealthier. And you've got, folks who are having a harder time climbing out of, sort of the lower middle class because of the cost of education, because of a transition to the service economy where there are fewer and fewer, high-skilled jobs available. So all that as a backdrop leads me to think that the Republican Party, we don't yet quite know what the identity of the Republican Party is going to be 2 or 4 or 6 years from now. And until we know that, we don't know what schism is going to take place. I mean, I've long believed, I've proven to be wrong so far, but I've long believed that, just because we've had 2 political parties in this country for, the better part of, almost 200 years doesn't mean we're going to stay that way. What's happening in the American left is going to become much more pronounced in the coming, 4 to 8 years, where they're going to go through a process in a different way than Republicans just went. Their party's moving very far to the left, and there's going to be a bunch of Democrats who at some point say, like, I'm not so sure I'm for that. I'm not a Republican. And you'll have a bunch of Republicans, again, if Trump reemerges, the party becomes, sort of very anti-defense, or at least anti-engagement, that there could be a third party in this country. So I think there's a lot of, frankly, uncertainty all the way around.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. That was really good by all 3 of you. So a couple of you mentioned some things that I want to pick up on. I forget which one of you, it might have been Trevi or it might have been Henry, who talked about a big schism in the party being between the reality-based versus non-reality-based communities. And an element of that also is consistent with populism, right? Which is, part of populism isn't policy-based at all, but rather just sort of like a general anti-elite sentiment. And the elites that are the targets in this case tend to not be rich people, but rather, intellectual elites, cultural elites, and anti-intellectualism and broad distrust, suspicion of the intelligentsia seems to be a central component to Republican Party politics these days. Given that all 3 of you are in fact members of that intelligentsia, I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Well, that was building on my comments, so I'll jump in. And I have a PhD, I'll freely admit it.
Yeah.
But look, I think there's a distinction between criticizing American elites, specifically the bias that you see against Republicans in the media, and also the bias you see against Republicans in academia, no offense. But, you have to look far and wide to find Republican professors on campus. I'm a PhD, and I knew there was no prospect for a professor job when I was coming out of my PhD training, because they're just not welcome on campus. And so I think there's a distinction between that anti-elitism and skepticism of liberal tendencies or biases, whatever you want to call it, in the media and in academia and in Hollywood, and then being in the non-reality based community where you believe in conspiracy theories and Jewish space lasers and all this crazy stuff. Yeah. So there is a real distinction to be made. And a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece for the New York Times, not as prolific as Henry, but I do have some things I've written in the past. And I talked about what actually holds the Republican Party at this point and what holds it together. And I identified a number of things. Number one was a kind of general support for less government / lower taxes, deregulation, just generalized. There are just disagreements on specifics. Number two was support for conservative judges, Federalist Society type originalism, constitutionalism in the judiciary. Number three was a support for Israel. You find that up and down across the Republican Party and less so in the Democratic Party. And the fourth thing that I identified was a concern and a willingness to criticize these kinds of liberal biases in academia, Hollywood, and in the media. And so I think those four things are not exactly the Reagan agenda of lower taxes, strong fight in the Cold War, anti-crime, but they are kind of the makings of something that might hold this messy thing called the Republican Party together and might bring us past what we're going through now and into perhaps a brighter future.
I guess what I would, just briefly respond and say, I think that's true with what you say with respect to establishment Republicans, the general Republican, but there's nothing in that for the populist. That roughly somewhere around a quarter to a sixth to a quarter of Donald Trump's vote was people who didn't vote for Republicans before Donald Trump came in. And they don't necessarily support smaller government or think that defending Israel is a priority or those things. And there has to be a broader conception of that. And that's why I think a national conservative populist alliance where you add things to what you just said, as opposed to removing over that is definitely the way to go. And I think that that's not only going to be something that is a way to keep the current coalition, but it's a way to expand it. One of the things I've written before about is that if you take a look at like Kansas in the fight over Sam Brownback's tax cuts, in 2010, he enacted a big tax cut that was loved by the supply side community. And 5 years or 6 years later, Kansas voters ousted a lot of his backers in the primary and overrode his veto to reinstall the taxes. And the places that did that were the exact same suburbs that moved in the direction a couple of years later in favor of Hillary Clinton the left. Why? Because they're not part of that coalition that wants smaller government and stuff. They want more effective government. They still want a role that can see government as helping their aspirations. And in that conservative populist agenda, at a worldview is something that can speak to them as well and not exclude them if it's shorn of the personality of Donald Trump and is soundly in, as you say correctly, Trevi, the reality-based community.
All right, thanks a lot for that. Did you have anything to add, Sarah, or shall I move on?
You can move on. Very interesting and good intellectual discussion, but I don't have anything new to add between my colleagues here. So.
Yeah, and just to clarify, just to make sure everybody in attendance watching knows, I did not intend to equate the conspiratorial right with the broader, much more widely shared view that is critical of, so-called liberal bias in media and academia. That's a much bigger question, of course, that we could talk about on a different day. But one thing that we all agree on is that those two things are not the same thing. So let me ask you this. Let's just go ahead and talk about Trump. I think that's probably on the minds of a lot of people who are, who tuned into this, right? They want to get a sense of the degree to which Trump, is going to continue to lead this party, right, from within or without, from Mar-a-Lago or wherever, and what his prospects might be for 2024. But just in general, to what extent do you guys still see the party as in the grip of Trump?
Well, I mean, I think it's firmly in the grip of Trump today. I mean, he is the 800-pound, sort of gorilla in the corner of the party right now. And I don't think that's going to change until there's a nominee. He'll have to make a decision about how much he wants to be engaged in primaries, how much score settling he wants to do for people he believes to have wronged him. If he does want to run again, which I think is unlikely, he's going to be 4 years older. He's going to be dealing with a bunch of legal issues, most likely, particularly out of the Southern District of New York. But, he's going to have to sort of decide, if he, in his post-presidency, does he want to, try to be remembered for some of the, frankly, very good things he's done that he does not get credit for. The Abraham Accords, in my view, the tax cuts that he pushed and or enacted were very positive. The economy speaks for that, pre-pandemic. at some point, you know, when an individual leaves office, and Trump is certainly unconventional, and there's sort of been no evidence to suggest he'll do things the way former presidents have done, but they do start to typically think about their library, their legacy, their major accomplishments. You know, history is not going to be kind to him because of what happened at the Capitol and because of some of the other missteps and the way he conducted himself. Certainly not in the short term, and probably not even in the long term, but 25 or, you know, 30 years from now, it's a fair telling of the Trump presidency would look at just how much he changed the party and frankly how successful politically he was. He has been a very successful political president, but for the fact that he, you know, frankly shot himself in this election. So I think, you know, he's going to dominate it. He is dominating it today still. You know, to your last question, there's going to be a reckoning in technology over the censorship of conservatives. And I think too many people in the media, in academia, they use the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world as an excuse, you know, to label the entire Republican Party. And they don't take the broad view that you have done, David, which is to say, like, this is a very diverse party with a lot of history and, you know, from Reagan forward. And there's a lot of those people are still in the party and very active and speaking. So I think he dominates it. I don't think he's going to stop dominating it until there's a new nominee. And the point in which there's a new nominee, he will become the secondary player. And Republicans are going to have to manage through this for the next 4 years, and it's going to be tough.
I generally agree with Sara with one slight caveat, which is I agree that the former president is the head of the party or the leading voice in the party until somebody else emerges as the head. I think one of the reasons that they tanked, that the White House tanked the Georgia races, and I think they did tank the Georgia races, is because Mitch McConnell would have been the face of the Republican Party if they had held on and become the majority party in the Senate. I think if you look back to '94, Newt Gingrich emerges is the face of the Republican Party even before '96 when Bob Dole becomes the nominee. So it's possible someone else can emerge before that, but that person would have to have some kind of institutional role that lets them be the leader of the party. And unless that happens, then the next leader of the party is indeed the nominee, and we have to wait almost 4 years for that to happen.
And I would agree with what both Sara and Trevi said. I would just say that the challenge of the Republican, the ambitious people who want to be the next leader of the Republican Party, the challenge is getting that conservative populist alliance right. That there is a very large segment of the anti-Trump wing or the grudging Trump wing in the Republican Party who really thinks that there should be minimal policy and rhetorical concessions to the populist side, and really thinks that the pre-Trump Republican Party just needs a new face. And I think, you know, a lot of people on that side really love Nikki Haley, and I like Nikki Haley too, but I don't think that's a winning. If she were the nominee, I'm pretty confident she would lose, absent terrible economic conditions, and assuming that the Democrats didn't capture that by having their own revolutionary figure take control of the party. I think the way to stop Trump's personal control is to sanitize Trumpism by making conservative populism a respectable mainstream view, which I think it is, shorn of the eccentricities and craziness of people like Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene. And once that happens, I think a lot of the people who are flocking to Trump will find, much as in, you know, to use a rock band analogy, the Beatles were great, but once you had the Monkees and the Kinks and a lot of Beatles imitators, you found people actually finding that they preferred the imitators better because they brought something new. And I think once people start singing more from that hymnal, I think you'll see personal loyalty to Trump decline.
Yeah, just one quick thing. First of all, I'm not sure I can agree with you on the Monkees, Henry. You know, they're just not in the same league as the Beatles. But the question I would have for you is, why are you so confident that Nikki Haley would not win if she ran in 2024? Is it just because you think she doesn't have that populist component, or just can you elaborate on that point?
Yeah, I had a feeling. I was talking to somebody who was a Nikki Haley fan. I think Nikki Haley has been putting herself firmly in the pre-Trump renewal party. I don't think there's anywhere that she has exhibited any sort of policy innovation or rhetorical innovation that demonstrates she is actively concerned about the cultural fight. I think the things she talks about, her Hudson Institute speech, Hudson Institute's a wonderful institution. I'm glad that you sponsored her for the talk, but basically her talk was a direct submarine missile aimed at moderation of neolibertarian economics. And I think that it is central and to populism, that understanding that the reason blue collar voters didn't vote for the pre-Trump Republican Party in the same numbers that they do with the Trump Republican Party is they don't want that. They want markets to work and more help and protection. And Donald Trump offered that. Nikki Haley and the establishment don't. And the way she's going strongly suggests to me that she will be the kinder, gentler version of the Romney-Ryan ticket. And I think that is a massive loser with the broad American population.
Yeah, one quick point on that. I wouldn't say that I'm a Nikki Haley fan per se. I'm not opposed to her. I think she is one of a number of potentially viable candidates for 2024. I have not yet signed up with who my preferred person is, but I think there are some people who I'd be comfortable with and some people I wouldn't be comfortable with.
So let me go ahead and jump into that, right? This will be our last question before we take Q&A. Since, we raised Nikki Haley and we've been talking a little bit about 2024, I see kind of three potential wings actually of candidates. So one being the traditional conservatives, and you guys can tell me if any of this is wrong, and please do. But I agree with Henry that I would lump Haley in under the conservative banner, along with Ben Sasse and a couple of others. I see the kind of candidate that Henry's talking about maybe being personified in the newest iteration of Marco Rubio. And it is the newest iteration, but that's it. And it's funny. I think people were looking to Josh Hawley as possibly being that person until a few weeks ago. And then there's a third category, which again I wouldn't characterize as populist in the way that Henry means it, but I think other people would use that term to think of them, which are really more pugilistic or even something else. And I would think of Christie Noam. Any of the Trump children, maybe Tom Cotton. I'm not sure exactly where he falls, but there's that distinction, right, between people who don't necessarily want to continue that libertarian tradition on economics or the militaristic tradition in foreign policy, versus people who really just want to own the libs, right, and stir people up that way. But more generally, my question to you guys is, with those names or any of the other names that I haven't mentioned yet, who do you think's got a shot? Where is the party potentially going in terms of its standard bearer 3.5 years from now?
I have no idea who's going to be the nominee. And the reason I say that, I'm a pretty well-studied operative, I will say, having worked on a number of presidential campaigns. I think there's going to be 20 candidates.
Yeah.
And so I think we're going to be similarly situated as we were the last time we had an open primary, where there's going to be a flavor of the month. Everybody's going to, every serious person who raises serious money is going to have a turn and an opportunity to, seize control. I think the future successor, though, likely figures out what Trump got right in terms of the coalition and the message and the policies, and figures out how to put a different package around that and a different brand around it. And I think for that individual, they're going to have to think through, I don't want to speak for Trevi, but I always consider him, I know he worked in the Trump administration, but I always consider him a Bush Republican first. Like, people, who come from sort of the Bush wing of the party, to say, okay, you know, that is still a big piece of the party. They have a worldview on democracy, you know, around the globe and the importance of that. They have a worldview on compassionate conservatism. They use different language. And, you know, frankly, Trump could have won election night had he just treated, you know, the people who were the loyalists to McCain, Bush, and Romney better as a class, you know, without adopting their policies. You know, he could have lowered the flag, you know, in the Capitol when Senator McCain died quickly. He could have invited the president to do a video at the Republican National Convention, which he did not, President Bush. He could have not trashed Romney at every single. So somebody who is decent, even if they don't agree with where the party has been in the past, I think does a lot to bring kind of the more, what we would call now moderate Republicans, you know, around under a coalition. So there's some healing that has to happen by this person. But they're likely going to be more Trump in terms of their approach and policy, and more Bush in terms of their style.
Let me jump in here a second, and I just want to make sure. I think Sara suggested that I worked in the previous administration. I did not, so I just want to clarify.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Trevi. I misspoke.
Yeah. So I just want to make that very clear, and you know, intentionally. But a couple of points. I think that Sara called me a Bush Republican. I worked for George W. Bush. I was proud to work for George W. Bush. But I would call myself a conservative. Yeah. And the leader of the party is the vessel. I like to think of the great William Rusher, who was the publisher of National Review, who said, don't put your faith in politicians. They will always disappoint you. So I don't count on any politician to represent all of my views. But I am from the school of Ed Koch, who was the mayor of New York, and happened to be a friend of mine late in life, a great guy, savvy politician, Democratic mayor of New York. And he said, if you agree with me on 8 out of 12 issues, you should vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 out of 12 issues, you should see a psychiatrist. Because I don't pick a politician that I agree with on everything. You know, I am unique and everybody else is as well. I look for somebody who is going to advance in total the perspectives that I believe in and the policies that I agree in. So again, I was on board with George W. Bush. I don't think that makes me a Bush Republican per se. Bush was the appropriate vessel. And again, I was proud to work for him. So I think that's an important distinction. Another distinction is, I think, David, your categories were generally right, but I'm not sure you're right about who you put in them. So you're putting Haley and Sass in the same category. I think there's a real distinction in that Sass has been a critic of the outgoing president and never served in that administration. And Haley did serve in that administration. I think that puts them in different categories. I think you put Tom Cotton in this kind of pugilistic category along with the Trump kids. I think Tom Cotton is aggressive and does have some of this populism, but I wouldn't put him in the same category with the Trump kids, which is a more MAGA territory than I would put Cotton in. So I think these distinctions are going to make a difference. And I think that the person who runs and wins in 2024, and I'm not going to tell you who it is because I don't know, is someone who manages to navigate that kind of circle of conservatism, I call it. Here's my little circle. On the one hand, there are people who kind of fall off the edge of the earth into MAGAism, and I don't think that person can win. And then there are the other people who are so far never Trump that they actually were rooting for the Democrats in 2018 and said, I want the Democrats to win the 2018 election, to take over the House and the Senate, and I want Joe Biden to win this election. I think those people were maybe a bridge too far on one side, and I think the complete MAGA people were a bridge too far on the other. And I think the person who can win is the person who can make that large mass of Republicans happy without having been in those two other camps.
I would agree with Trevi on that. The way I've been talking about it is less the who and more of the camps of voters. I think that you're seeing people kind of form themselves in different ways that appeal to different aspects of the Republican voter base. One is what I call the young reformers, the people who are trying to put a policy gloss that accepts the conservative populist alliance. And I've put Rubio and Cotton and Hawley in that. They have their differences. You know, Hawley was clearly trying to play more to uniting that with social conservatism and evangelical community, whereas Cotton has more of a national defense angle. But I thought they fell together more than separately. Then you've got what I would call the Restorationists, where I would put a Sass and a Cruz and a Christie Noem and a Nikki Haley, whose policy substance is not going to be a whole lot different, but who have different ways of interpreting the return. You know, three of them pay fealty to Donald Trump in some way. Obviously, Ben Sass does not. I would agree with Trevi that that has a snowball's chance of flying through the hot summer of competition in the Republican Party, but people have tried more quixotic efforts. And then there's what I'd call the imperial successors, which is the people who basically say more Trump, less something. And that's where you get the Trump children and Mike Pence in the same category. That for the Trump children, it's more owning the libs and less policy. And Mike Pence, it'll be more, you know, more Trump on policy, less tweet, and bring his personality to that. And then I would throw another name out, which is Chris Christie. That Chris Christie is somebody who, in the New Hampshire primary, was the only candidate in the exit poll to rate alongside Donald Trump when among voters who said their biggest priority in a candidate was telling it like it is. So he has a little bit of that Trumpian personality without the craziness. And he's firmly establishmentarian on a lot of policy. And that's a different brand. And then you've got the fact that in American politics, people always come up, you know, that 2 years ago, no one knew who Lauren Boebert or Marjorie Taylor Greene were. In 2017, no one knew who AOC was. American politics is always incredibly fluid on the who. You know, if you'd asked me 12 months ago, is Christie Noem a national figure? I would have said, you know, what did you do? Just come back from Colorado and buy something on the street? But, you know, she had her ambition and she's put herself on the map. And we know that other people will do that, whether they are figures from outside politics or whether they are ambitious politicians who will put themselves on the map. So, but I think they will all fall somewhere in that category of interpreting Trumpism rather than opposing it. And that means lots of different people will be trying on different hats and seeing what sticks.
All right.
I got to say one quick thing on this. You know, Henry talked about my categories of the people who went too far in the anti-Trump category. And I think there are those people who really went and supported the Democrats in 2018, 2020. I think that's different than Sass. I think Sass is clearly a Trump critic, but has continued to vote conservative and says he's a Republican and continues to be a Republican and supports Republican ideas. So I really think there is a distinction there. And I know we're trying to make very fine distinctions. I think everybody's just trying to figure out what is the right place to be. I can go this far and no further, I guess, is the approach that people are taking. But I do think there is a distinction to be made there, just as I think there's a distinction to be made between Haley and Sass, because Haley served in the previous administration and Sass decidedly did not, and I'm sure would not.
All right, thanks, y'all. And you know, just to add to Henry's point about people emerging, as I rudely interrupted a second ago, but to reiterate, you know, who had ever heard of, let alone could pronounce the name of Pete Buttigieg, you know, 2 years ago, and he actually wound up coming reasonably close to capturing a nomination, or at least won an important primary or caucus anyway. So we're shifting to the Q&A portion now. And we've got a lot of them here. And, you know, in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much time like reading carefully through all of these before I ask them. But the first one that I see here, and this is from an anonymous attendee, says numerous senators indicated support of the fact that the 2020 election results were illegitimate. Is this a strategy that we might see in 2022? Anybody who feels like they'd like to answer that?
I don't think we'll see that as a strategy again. I don't think that has worn well for those individuals. And not I don't think just because of the siege on the Capitol, that although that did make it more pronounced. You know, it's just been so repudiated in every corner. And I do think the party and the people leading the party need to be intellectually honest. I think a smarter track to take would be, look, the means and the methods by which we're voting are going to change because technology is changing and people are changing. And, you know, and I thought the Republicans should embrace that. But, you know, there are states that do it very, very well, like Texas, in Florida, and there were states that didn't do it so well. It didn't really work that well in Pennsylvania. It doesn't mean the Democrats stole it, but it didn't work very well. And so, you know, I think that we should embrace, you know, certain election reforms. And I think we should, as a party, look to make the system work better and be more efficient and learn from states that have figured out, you know, how to do mail-in voting in an appropriate way. I think the Democrats are likely to overreach and do a power grab where, you know, they're going to want to do automatic enrollment and do, you know, things that do present more challenges in elections. And, you know, we'll see how that debate plays out. It's a very worthy debate, but just sort of categorically saying the election is fraudulent is not a winning strategy.
Yeah, just one quick point on that. I think this is a dangerous and disturbing trend that we've been seeing over the last 20 years, the sense that if you lose an election, you claim that it was fraudulent or stolen. And I want it to go away on both sides. I just don't want to see this anymore. I think the legitimacy of our elections is one of our great gifts to democracy and to civilization. And again, I think that we've seen it again on both sides. It's a problem. And I think we need to call it out on the Republican side. I think the Democrats need to call it out on the Democrat side. And it's really got to stop. So I'm pretty adamant on that point.
Okay, I'm gonna, unless you have something to add, Henry, I'm gonna jump into one here that I think is directed toward you, but others might have thoughts on it too. It says, Mr. Olsen mentioned bringing the Republican Party to a future where they can be more appealing to minority populations. And indeed, you referenced how the Republicans did better in 2020 than they often have, especially in certain places like the Rio Grande Valley and you know, down there in Miami and all that. You know, given the history of the party, what kind of image rehabilitation might that entail, or what's that work look like to make the party more appealing, do you think, to more minority populations?
I think what it should look like is holding a hand out to immigrants, being clear about the enforcement of the law. You know, I don't think that allowing millions of people to flow across the border is popular even with many immigrants and many non-whites. But I think that what you need to do is be clear that if you're here legally, you're welcome. And that we're here to give you a hand up. And a hand up can mean subsidizing health insurance. And a hand up can mean tight labor markets, because the non-white population is going to be the population that increasingly is our working class. And they will be the ones who will be, if they're not already, competing with foreign labor directly and indirectly. I think it means having a less Protestant cast to the way we talk about social issues and a more inclusive one. That there are many people who are in the immigrant classes who are not evangelical Protestant, but they may agree with respect to questions about how schools are run, and they may agree with respect to the sanctity of life, or with respect to protecting families from malign influences through the media, but don't see it through the lens that many traditional Republicans do. You see in Ontario, where conservative populists swept the immigrant communities in the Ontario provincial election, winning places that the Canadian Liberal Party usually wins in the federal election. And what were one of the things that they used? They used social issues. The immigrant community was very upset that transgender-friendly education was going to be instituted under the Liberal government in second grade. And you didn't have to talk about theology or use God. All you had to do was talk about common sense family values. And you had immigrants from South Asia and East Asia backing the conservative populist candidate. That's the direction that the Republican Party needs to go in, moderating its libertarian economics, moderating social issues so that it's no longer theological, but is instead sociological. And you'll see that party be a lot more popular among non-whites.
Can I jump in and say something on this point as well? Look, I noticed that Connie Morella is on this, Congresswoman. She's actually from a former Congresswoman. She's from the district that I live in right now. And she represented this district, which is a fairly liberal district in Maryland. And she did it very well for a long time. And I think that, I don't think that could happen today, but I think we would be in a better situation if we could have liberal Republicans and conservative Republicans who could run in their districts and win in the districts according to who is in that district and according to the population in that district. And if we just say, oh, we're only going to win the rural communities and the heavy red states, then the Republican Party is not going to be able to be a majority party. So again, shout out to Congresswoman Morella for being on this panel, but also I think we should really look back. She is, let me be clear, she is to the left of where I am. I'm personally more conservative than she is, but I really appreciated the fact that we had people like her who could run in these kinds of liberal districts. And right now, the congressman who represents this district, Jamie Raskin, I think is far to the left of a lot of people in this community, and they would be happy to vote for Connie Morella again. But that's not what the Republican Party is offering these days. And I think we should be able to offer that as well as the red state rural Republicans at the same time.
Sarah, do you have anything to add, or shall I move on?
You can move on.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, I'm going to read a question by my colleague Saul Newman in the Department of Government, whom I believe Trevi knows personally. So to what extent are Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene symptoms of the problem rather than the cause of the problem itself? Gerrymandering and the conspiratorial capabilities of the web make hard-right conspiratorialists more likely to rise to the head of the pack. In addition, as the growing number of well-educated knowledge workers identify as Democrats, the Republicans need to mobilize low socioeconomic status, working class, and rural anti-elitist citizens. This low SES population may not vote in sufficient numbers unless they are mobilized in a Trumpian fashion. So I'm not exactly sure what the question is there, Saul, but I think you guys can get the gist. I think Henry may have already kind of spoken to this, but do either of the other of you have anything else to comment in response to that question, or comment, I should say?
Well, look, I think, you know, in my view, I think it's a false choice to suggest that, you know, this is somehow, you know, low educated, you know, poor people, uneducated, reading Facebook for their news, you know, is the root of the problem here. You know, I think, you know, if you take a step back, you know, there's a variety of things that have contributed to the point in which we are today, which is to say, you know, lack of trust in institutions, you know, people sort of feeling like they can't get ahead in life without a college degree, not having a college degree. You know, that's where I think this anti-elitism comes from. And I'll take the point that I do think that to some degree, yes, I agree that Trump is a symptom, not the cause. He became, you know, in power because of people's sort of frustration with both parties, lack of popularity of both parties, the lack of confidence in, you know, basically every major institution, unless you're wearing a uniform, which now even is not the case anymore with the police. So, you know, we are going through like a massive amount of change in this country when you think about economic change, technological change, demographic change, you know, in a very short period of time. And, you know, I think that's roiled our politics, but I don't think that the Republican Party's problem is because there's a bunch of uneducated, you know, people. I think that Trump exploited that for his political gain. He was only about himself. I think a future leader can put together a coalition that brings out the best of many factions of the American population under one tent in a future Republican Party or a different party.
Thank you. And I'm just going to move on to the next question in the interest of time, and because I think that was a great answer. There are two more questions that I really want to get through here that I think are good. The first one is from an anonymous attendee and says, this has been a great discussion of how the GOP moves forward. Thank you. All the talk about how the party moves forward has been focused on what the GOP will do without much consideration, it seems, of how the Democrats will impact things. The GOP will not move forward in a vacuum. Will the Democrats not continue to tie whoever the next nominee is to Trump? Will they not continue to use him as a club to beat the party up for years? If they do, how can the GOP overcome that?
Let me jump in on this one. Look, it's clear the Democrat strategy is going to be to wave this bloody flag and talk about the outgoing president, the former president, and try to make him the face of the Republican Party. And the way the Republicans get past that is to pick a new face for the Republican Party. The Republicans love to bring out the specter of Jimmy Carter for years and years, but eventually the Democrats said, okay, well, let's go with Bill Clinton. And he's not Jimmy Carter. And he tried specifically not to have Carter people in his administration. And he actually alienated Carter. They didn't always get along so well. And I think you know what the Democrats are going to do. You know they're going to make Trump their way to weaken the Republicans and try to push forward more and more liberal policies. And what the Republicans have to do is to put forward their own face and a different face, and also highlight the ways that the Democrats are drifting left in ways that make Republican voters and just regular American voters uncomfortable, kind of like the point that Henry was making about the immigrant voters. I think Republicans made nice gains among the African-American community in this last election, among Hispanic Americans in this last election. And I remember I worked with Karl Rove in the 2004 election. Sara worked with me as well. And what was the strategy in that election? The strategy was to hold your base, meaning hold the white evangelicals who voted for Bush in 2000, and increase your margins. Don't necessarily win a majority because that wasn't possible, but increase your margins among Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Jewish Americans, women. And he did that. Bush increased the percentage he got in all of those groups while holding on to his base. And that is the one popular vote victory that Republican presidential candidates have had in 22 years, as you said earlier.
Well, I think the other thing here that's really important to think about is Democrats, you're right. It's not going to be in a vacuum. And there's going to be lots of things Democrats do, irrespective of what Donald Trump is or isn't doing in the backdrop, that cause Americans, to either embrace them or pause. And I think Henry pointed it out earlier, there's some evidence that they're being pretty bold and pretty aggressive. And they're heading in a much more progressive fashion than Joe Biden's, sort of advisors suggested he would be. He would be sort of the moderate who brought the party together. Like the regulatory so far has been pretty bold. We'll see what they can get through in reconciliation, but a tax cut, no Keystone Pipeline, bold climate change that has economic impacts in the country. Like these aren't necessarily going to be things that they may sound good today. They may not be very good economic policy. And 2 or 3 years later, we could be having a pretty different conversation about the economy if that takes hold.
Okay. Henry, do you have anything to add? You're muted.
I think the Democrat strategy, the fact is the Democrats' coalition ranges from people who call themselves democratic socialists to people who voted for Mitt Romney, voted Republican for governor in 2018, and voted Republican for Congress in 2020. That's a very difficult coalition to hold together in a positive way. They held that coalition in 2020 in a negative way, saying, we agree that Donald Trump is bad orange man. Marjorie Taylor Greene is the flavor du jour of doing that. This is not what you want America to look like. Question is whether or not Republicans continue to give them that piñata to keep knocking around, hoping the candy's going to fall. Every Republican knows you don't want to do that. And I think it's really hard to make a person who's not that person look like that person. Witness how hard it is for Republicans to say to normal looking Democrats, well, it's really AOC and Nancy Pelosi in a different guise. That almost never works in persuading swing voters. So, and the Democrats will have a record to defend. And who knows what's going to happen. Maybe in 2024, we'll be looking at a peace, prosperity, and everything. And people will say, hey, that's a pretty good record. And maybe we'll be looking at the inability to reopen the economy after COVID with continued work stoppages, with an increase in racial and religious tension and decline in America abroad. I can make a case that either might happen, and that will have a huge determining factor on whether or not pointing to bad orange man will be a persuasive issue in 2024 for them.
All right, thanks a lot. So last question. I would like to thank all the panelists for their thoughtful and constructive comments. As a conservative living in a deeply blue state, I have seen a lot of the thoughtful, rational Republicans around me receding into silence for fear of being associated with the more radical members of the party. Recognizing that there are extremists on both sides, how do we advance or rebuild rational discourse within the population at large? So this is kind of moving us away from talking about Republicans onto any ideas that you guys may have about trying to lower the temperature and have more reasonable debates.
Yeah, let me jump in on this one. So there was a poll that showed that 86% of the country is in what I would consider the normal world. There's 8% extremes on the left, 6% extremes on the right. So that's 14% total. And then 86% want not crazy, not screaming, not the fighting you see on MSNBC or Fox or on Twitter, but they just want to live their lives as normal Americans. And I think that people like this good questioner should recognize that they are in the majority, not the crazies, that they are what makes America great, not the people who are screaming on both sides. And I think that we really need to move in that direction. Now, with respect to the ability to take down certain Republicans who have different views, I think the previous president, as Jonah Goldberg would like to say, had one superpower. His superpower is that he could destroy a Republican that he set his sights on. I don't know that he will continue to have that superpower after he is no longer president, and certainly without a Twitter account. So we'll see. I mean, people, after a war or a pestilence or whatever, they slowly come out of their hiding holes. They slowly come out of the places where they were hiding to see if it's safe. And people will start to emerge and make comments about how we should be a reality-based party. And we'll see if those people can get through. I think some people will be bolder and start saying it earlier, and some people will be a little more timid and they'll hang back. But remember, 86% are in the normal world, and I want those 86% to win out.
I think it's hard. I mean, candidly, it's the right goal, and it's a good goal. And I think we're just in a time of extreme polarization, and it's just going to be tough, I think, for a while. But political movements change, ideologies take hold. Personal style matters in leadership, and at some point there will be, sort of different leadership in both parties that, probably helps this long term. So.
I also think we need to understand what politics is, that politics naturally involves exaggeration and sharp rhetoric to create differences. That, when people talk about the great heights of American debate, they often cite the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And then you go and read them. And it's Lincoln saying that Douglas was an active, willing member of a conspiracy to bring slavery to the North with the current Supreme Court justice, current president, and past president. And Douglas saying that Lincoln was part of a conspiracy with crazy racial equalitarians who he called them Black Republicans. And it was very high-minded in one sense, very intellectual. In another sense, it was really down and dirty, nasty, and unfactual. And that is part of politics. So if somebody wants to say, well, if we have sharp words, that's not the world I want to live in. Well, that's not the world we're going to live in, because politics always encourage sharp words. The question is whether there are serious things going on behind that, and also whether or not we treat people with whom we have sharp words as adversaries or enemies. Americans have always treated them as adversaries, and that means we don't have collapses of regimes. Countries that treat your adversaries as enemies ultimately end up losing democracy.
You know, I remember something that Bob Dole used to say on the campaign trail in 1996 about Bill Clinton. He said, "He's my opponent, not my enemy." And I think that's the approach that many of us should take, both within party struggles and party struggles with the other party as well.
Yeah. Amen to that.
Yeah, and John McCain famously, corrected the woman at one of his town halls who called Obama a Muslim or something like that, and he corrected her and suffered a little bit for it in some corners, but that was another example of that kind of thing.
He suffered, but he also benefited, because 20 years later, or was it 15 years later, he's still talking about what a great thing he did. So I think we're doing this for the long term, and I think in the long term, McCain benefited from that comment more than he hurt from it.
Right. And what I would just say is that, Republican Party today, what you have to do is have that treatment of somebody as an adversary while being sharp about how you are adversaries. One of the criticisms of people on the right is that when push came to shove, people like Romney and McCain didn't really have their heart in what they were saying that divided Republicans from Democrats. So the next Republican leader has to be clear about the adversarial nature of politics. I mean to rule, and we mean to exert power, while saying the people who we disagree with, when we exert power, we will treat as equal citizens, even as we enact our vision.
All right. I'll leave it there. Thank you guys so much, all three of you. I thought this was great and really informative and insightful. I hope all of you watching on your computers at home or wherever you are did so as well. And so if we can, all offer a round of applause for our panelists here. You guys can't see them, but we'll assume that they're doing that. I'll go ahead and send you on your merry way. Thank you very much again.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Yep.
Thank you.